Hello, everyone. We are back to do another commentary in our series on theater and theology. This time, we are going to be looking at X-Men Days of Future Past. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jesse Kissman, and I am the lead pastor at River Tree Community Church out in Baldwin, Missouri. And yeah, we're going to jump right into it, and I think we're going to have some fun. There's a lot of good stuff in this movie, so we're going to have some fun discussing it. So I will try to get us synced up here. I'll kind of describe what's going on, and when the 20th Century Fox logo blacks out, I'll say so. We can try to get synced up that way. So I am pressing play now in 3, 2, 1. 20th Century Fox logo is swinging down. Lights are going up. And it is blacking out. Wait for it. Now. You have dude shoot the arrow. The TSG logo is up on the screen now. It's blacking out right now. The Some Bad Hat Harry group is up there. Sansa Koze right in the middle there. I guess Koze would be, he's second from the right. Blacked out now. All right. Comic books flipping. Marvel, but not Marvel Studio, because this was the time when they were very distinct. Marvel's blacked out now. Right, so hopefully we're somewhat synced up, and I'll kind of describe what's going on for the first little bit to get it queued up here. We're hovering down into New York City, flying through the middle of a building with a hole in it. So the X-Men franchise is kind of notorious for basically ignoring the continuity of things that have come before it. So this is a question of what future is this? Is this the kind of rebooted X-Men future that, we kind of kicked off with X-Men First Class with a new group of people? Is it the future of the original? It's unclear. But so all you just don't, I have found, just don't worry about the continuity of these movies because it'll just confuse you. But so we're opening with, this kind of barren wasteland here. Something obviously terrible has happened in the past. Someone out hunting, kind of scavenging the landscape here. And what are they going to stumble across? Oh, an X-Men symbol. The belt of a fallen X-Men. Or woman. That's Colossus. Like that has to be Colossus right there, so that's a dude. And here we go, and that dude didn't make it. There you go. I do love how, because these first X-Men movie came out in like late 90s, early 2000s, something in there. And they had these long, drawn-out title sequences. I do kind of love how they just kept that going. You don't see title sequences like this in like in movies now. And the X-Men franchise just decided they were going to roll with it. This was the time like X-Men did it, the Raimi Spider-Mans did it. These really long sequences here. So the main premise of this movie is, we have this future where basically the X-Men have lost. The Sentinels have taken over. Things are real bad. So they send someone back in time to try to prevent them from losing. Kind of very Terminator-esque, I guess, if you were. Only if you think you take that analogy in this case, Wolverine, Hugh Jackman, who ends up going back in time, is kind of the Terminator role. But, we'll see. So this movie combines two genres that I really enjoy. Superhero movies, I'm a big fan of, and time travel movies. I have a huge soft spot in my heart for time travel movies. I just absolutely love them. And in time travel movies, there's a couple different conceits you have. You have the first style of time travel, which is if you go back in time, you can change your current future. This is the kind of Back to the Future Terminator style. If you're going with the Terminator one, when Skynet sends the Terminator back, and the human resistance sends Kyle Reese back, it ends up being this kind of self-fulfilling circle of, would the Terminators have been created if they hadn't sent the Terminator back in time in the first place? Would John Connor have been created if they hadn't sent Kyle Reese back? All of that. So you have that one, the conceit that everything kind of is a closed circle. Then you have the kind of other form of time travel, which is really more like dimension hopping, which is the mere act of you jumping through time, going into the past. Just that act means you are in a different timeline now. You cannot get back to the future you left because you are now in a future in which you have time traveled. It's ridiculously confusing, but this movie seems to take the first way of time travel, that everything's kind of a closed loop. You can jump back into your past and still get back into what is equivalent to your future because you've already been there before. It can really turn your head around, and I think that's why I love time travel movies so much. All right, so we have the Sentinels here. The Sentinels are very interesting kind of villains, if you were. They can mimic the powers of just about everyone they come in contact with. And as we'll see a little bit later, we can figure out why they can do that. But it makes them an extremely powerful force here. And poor Iceman and it looks like he might not make it here. All right, so here we have Kitty. Oh, they're gone now, but we have Kitty Pryde trying to do something here, trying to send, I think it's Bishop back in time. Oh, Iceman didn't make it. Poor Shawn Ashmore. Don't worry, he's going to be fine. So this is a really interesting strategy the kind of X-Men in this future world are employing here. That of when they are discovered, all they have to do is hold the Sentinels off. They basically sacrifice themselves over and over again so that Kitty Pryde can send Bishop, the guy on the table, back in time to warn themselves in the past when these guys will come, so that they're not there when they show up. So this happens over and over again. Who knows how many times they've done this. So all it takes, right here, he's about to blow them up, but before the beam can get to him, they're gone. Because Bishop has been back in time and warned them, so they were never here now. So they left prior to this. Aren't time travel movies fun? I guess why I love them so much. They're just ridiculous, but I love it. All right, so it looks like we are here inside Cerebro now. So Cerebro is the kind of device that Charles Xavier, the leader of the X-Men, uses to communicate or get a hold of or enhance his powers. So his power is, mind power. It's hard to pin down exactly what his power does because they change it movie to movie, comic to comic based on what they need. But it is kind of mind manipulation. So the Sentinel's kind of standing guard here. I really enjoyed this movie and the fact that they were able to get both casts back together here. Obviously in the future you have the kind of older cast from the kind of original X-Men movies, from the Bryan Singer ones. You're able to bring back people like Halle Berry, some of this group of people. Which, kind of interesting fact, I guess. Halle Berry plays Storm. She had a much bigger role in this movie, but got pregnant partway through. And so her role had to be cut down quite a bit because she couldn't do, these massive action sequences super pregnant. So, like, that's kind of a funny side note. So you have Magneto there, the kind of leader of the Brotherhood, who is the kind of generally the bad guys in the X-Men comics and movies. But here you see things are so bad that they have teamed up. So you have your villains and your heroes teaming up to take on a bigger villain, a bigger threat. I do like how do we show it's the future? Well, Charles Xavier's wheelchair's it's a hover chair, he's floating like rather than, try to figure out some way to, through feature tech, make it so he can walk again. Just, nope, you get a floating wheelchair. I'm a fan of that. So here Professor X explaining how they've been able to stay alive on the run for as long as they have. So this is, most movies have these kind of council scenes where we have to lay out the entirety of your plot. We have to give a big exposition dump to kind of set things up and explain things moving forward. And that's what we're doing. So we're being introduced to Oliver Trask here, who is our kind of main protagonist, our main villain of the movie. Kind of getting a little bit of backstory on what Raven or Mystique kind of has been up to since the days of Fergus, since the First Class movie, which was a reboot set in the 70s, kind of what her story arc has been up until now, and how it has really kind of created this world. How in many ways she is the key, the turning point that led to a world where everyone hates mutants. And now hate is one of the kind of key themes in the X-Men movies and comics and such. Like, it is honestly kind of the central theme why a lot of these movies, why a lot of these comics were initially created. The time they came out was in the 70s or so. It was just the notion of what has come to be known as the other, the someone different from yourself, and how is that person treated. And the main villain, Magneto, his whole thing is humans cannot treat us equal. They won't treat us as equals. They're afraid of us, and so what you're afraid of, you try to fight, you try to destroy. And so there's just so much wrapped up in that for us, as Christians today. This just notion of how do we treat the other? How do we treat someone different than ourselves? There are countless verses that talk about that. Like, how do you treat the other? How do you treat the alien? How do you treat the sojourner, the person different than you? Just about, if you're looking at some of the early kind of Old Testament books, Exodus has a number of passages on it. Leviticus does, Numbers, Deuteronomy. A good chunk of the laws of Moses kind of revolve around this notion of treating the other with respect, going out of your way to help the other. And a lot of the reasoning that's given is when God is giving these laws to them, do not mistreat the alien or oppress them, because you were once aliens in Egypt. You were once the other in Egypt. And I, being God, came in and helped you. So now you are to help the other. You are to help others. And you see that all throughout the Old Testament. A lot of the prophets, Ezekiel, for example, one of his main criticisms against the people is how they're not doing this, how they are not helping the other. They're not helping the alien. They're treating them poorly. They're treating them badly. They're denying them justice. And so that's, in the Ezekiel case, why a lot of this kind of misfortune is happening. Same thing with Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah. That's a lot of the stuff that he talks about, is the oppression of, the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, the other, and how the people are just letting evil happen to them. They're looking the other way. They're actively engaging in evil against these people. And so this is why God is angry with them. So, the X-Men franchise has taken this idea of the other and, obviously applied kind of superpowers to it, applied mutants to it. And that is why they are the other. They're the other because they are different, because they have these kind of powers that they have no control over. And so, there is just so much in all of these movies, especially if you go back to the Bryan Singer trilogy of X-Men movies. Those ones are all about that. The third one, it has such a powerful message of, they develop this, I guess, vaccine, for lack of a better word, that can cure mutancy, quote unquote, cure it. And so that whole film wrestles with that idea of, if I am different, the other, should the other be forced to conform? And that's the main struggle of that movie and the butting of heads in that movie. So I think the X-Men franchise does this better than a lot of franchises, is dealing with the notion of how hate, specifically hating the other, can drive us down paths that sometimes you can't get away from. And in this case, in the case of this movie, it drove us down a path to the point that the only way to fix it was to go back in time to change it. And so that's what we're doing here. Kitty Pryde is sending Logan, or Wolverine, back in time, back into the 70s, mainly because Wolverine's power is he ages ridiculously slowly, so he will basically be the same person in the 70s. And for a movie that is just much easier to do, to just keep Hugh Jackman rather than have to cast someone else or de-age someone else. In the comics, it is not Wolverine that goes back in time, but for simplicity's sake, they just chose it to be Wolverine here because you get more Hugh Jackman, and more Hugh Jackman is pretty much always a good thing. So you see him waking up here in the 70s, but he still has all his memories of everything up until the point he got sent back in time. So it's, again, time travel's fun, isn't it? So apparently in the script, this scene originally called for him to be wearing pajama pants. And on the day, Hugh Jackman basically said, like, no, I've worked out too much. I want to show off. And I mean, I can't really blame him. If I ever get to the point where I look as jacked as Hugh Jackman, I'm probably not wearing a shirt ever again. Just, if you work out that much and get to that point, I get it. We have Hugh Jackman not really knowing what's going on. Because for him, this event happens, decades, 50, 60, 70 years ago. When is the future of this movie set? Well, I honestly don't remember when the future was. Whatever. It's been decades and decades and decades for him, so he doesn't remember what's going on here. Just look at that 70s shirt. That is amazing. I'm loving that. The joke here obviously being he does not have his adamantium claws. So Wolverine's natural, it's a weird thing to say, but his normal mutant ability is quick healing and bone claws. Now in the future, he gets his body fused with adamantium, which is a made-up metal that is, designed to be the strongest metal on Earth. That obviously hasn't happened yet, so he just has his normal bone claws here. So here you have that interesting kind of discussion going on. You have the one side of, the mutants, the other, they're here living peacefully. Why do we need to do anything about it? And then you have Bolivar Trask kind of taking that other side, taking that things that are different from us are something to be feared. And the quote that he is giving here is a quote from Charles Xavier's dissertation. He is obviously misquoting it, or taking it out of context, but using it as a way to strike fear into people, using it as a way to pit a us against them mentality. So he's trying to say that, well, the other, being different than us, obviously wants to take over, obviously wants to supplant us. So we have to supplant them first. We have to prevent that from happening. And I think that there's a lot of this when you deal with, quote unquote, the other, someone different than you. A lot of the emotions and hate that come up from that are really driven by fear. People tend to be afraid of something different. They tend to be afraid of what they don't fully recognize or what they don't relate with 100%. And I think that is a natural thing, right? That is, or it's natural to be drawn to what you know. And when that doesn't happen, their natural tendency is to be afraid. But it's about pushing past that fear, looking for commonalities, looking for connections, rather than seeing someone as the other. Don't focus on what's different, focus on what's the same, focusing on how can we relate together. I think that's one of the reasons you can push past this. Now, I love this joke here. I don't know if you can quite see it. So this guy walking down the middle here, this is obviously Mystique in disguise. And if you can read the name on his jacket there, it's Sanders. So the joke being this, he has a title of Colonel. So you see right there, Colonel Sanders. That's a great kind of inside joke. I'm a big fan of that. So here we have Mystique coming in, trying to save some of these characters from the previous X-Men movie, from the X-Men First Class movie. So you have Havoc, Toad, some of those characters were main characters in the last movie, and now they're here. So we're having Mystique or Raven come in and try to save them. The character of Mystique, I think, is a really fascinating character. Because for the most part, she is a villain. in the comics and in a big chunk of the movies. But she is a villain that has no kind of, she's not a black and white villain. A lot of what she does has good motivations. A lot of what she does is to protect other people, is to protect mutants, is to try to save, ideals and such. But her big thing, I mean, you can even see it right here. Her big thing is she just always pushes and pushes slightly too far, pushes too far until she just ends up being a villain. It's like that old Batman line: you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. And that's what kind of her character does. She just pushes and pushes, is so passionate that she ends up, going too far, becoming that villain character. But she's just a fascinating character to watch because she is a relatable person for a lot of it. For a lot of what she does, you're kind of with her. You're like, yeah, no, I understand why you're doing this. So I think because of that, she's such a fascinating character to watch. Damn. And this guy here realizing he's just lost his battalion of mutants that he was supposed to take up to Trask to do testing on. So he is not very happy. Yeah, so here we get kind of our first prodigal son story. One of the reasons why I chose this one in particular is because of the kind of prodigal son themes woven through it. A little bit later in the movie, Professor X has a line that I really, really love. So the line is, just because someone stumbles, loses their way, it doesn't mean they're lost forever. Sometimes we just need a little help. And I think that is, I can't think of a more kind of Jesus inspired thinking than that, a mindset than that. We're all going to mess up. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That whole idea. But if we can believe just enough, if we can have people breathe into us that still believe in us, we can come back. It's that prodigal son notion. God will always welcome us back. We can come back. And so here we have the first kind of prodigal son moment where we have Professor X. The young Professor X has really lost his way. He he's given up. He doesn't really want to go on. He's just kind of secluded himself here. He's self-medicating. He doesn't want to, be Charles Xavier, the leader of the X-Men. He doesn't want that at this point. So it is Wolverine's job to get him to that point, to get him to the point where he can take up that mantle again. So the Patrick Stewart version of Xavier has sent Wolverine back to try to get his young version back on track. And so here we have that, prodigal son ideal. This Charles Xavier is out in the foreign land. He's wasted up. He's, this is his low point. He is sitting, eating with the pigs. And so now it's up to Wolverine here to try to convince him to return home, to try to convince him to step back into the light, take up that mantle again. This is always one of my kind of favorite scenes in a time travel movie. When you have someone who travels back in time and they have to convince someone that they are a time traveler. I don't know, I just love the kind of different ways movies do this. How would you convince someone you were a time traveler? Because no matter what you say, you're gonna sound crazy. But I just really enjoy when movies have to figure out how to do this. So here we go. This is why the Sentinels can mimic anyone's power. Because Raven or Mystique can her mutant ability is to mimic something's appearance. So they were able to weaponize that and create it so that the Sentinels can mimic anyone's power. Meaning they are basically indestructible. You know, if you have a mutant with a unique power that could potentially overpower them, the Sentinel can just mimic that power and send it back at them. So we're kind of introduced, this is the beginning of our second prodigal child narrative, Raven, or Mystique. So at this point, she's kind of lost her way too. As we saw, she's doing something with the best intentions, but she's on a path in the original timeline, she's on a path which will ultimately lead to her murdering Oliver Trask, murdering Peter Dinklage, the Dink. And that sets off a chain of events that ultimately leads to the future we saw at the beginning of the movie. So Wolverine here is trying to get her off of that path, trying to divert her from this kind of prodigal son path, trying to bring her back earlier, trying to bring her back before she gets to her sitting with the pigs moment, which in the original timeline is her killing Oliver Trask. So we're getting kind of the abridged backstory of how and why young Charles Xavier is, how he got to this point, what brought him to his sitting, eating with the pigs moment, which is kind of where he is now. And it's a story that's very relatable. You know, when you have loss building on top of loss, building on top of loss, which Hank is describing here, happened to Xavier. You know, that you can kind of connect the dots, and you can see how someone could end up being in their eating with the pigs moment. But I think that is where the counterbalance to that comes in, that idea of hope, which is another theme that I think is very prevalent in this movie, the notion of hope, the notion of even if you are in your darkest moment, there's still something to push through. There's still a way out. You know, the Bible is just littered with passages talking about the hope of the Lord, talking about how that hope will see us through. And I think that is such a powerful message in this movie in particular. Especially, when you bring in time travel into it, you could be the point of like, we're at the point of losing, but we still have hope because, the whole time travel thing. I think that is just a great undercurrent to this movie, that everything looks completely desperate. But if you still have the slightest hope, you can pull through. If you have the smallest amount of hope, the smallest amount of faith, that mustard seed size amount of faith, that can sometimes be all you need to pull you through. All right, so we got a planning a heist scene here. How do we break Magneto out of prison? This is a scene that I think is interesting, and it's one of my least favorite things when movies do this. So coming into this movie, you had an entire cast of characters from the previous X-Men movie, X-Men First Class. And how do you deal with them not being in this movie? It's one of the biggest questions you would always that would be natural to ask, right? Is, oh, why isn't this character in this movie? Well, we're going to find out that these characters were all killed off screen between movies. I'm not a fan of that. I know, infamously the Alien movies did that. They killed the little girl Newt and knock off Kyle Reese off screen. Like they were kind of some of the main characters of, the second Alien movie. The whole point, they were the survival hope story. And then they just get killed immediately off screen, the beginning of the next movie. And that's what we're doing here. So these characters were your main characters in the last movie. And for whatever reasons, contract, who knows, we just decided they're getting killed off screen. So that's their kind of in-movie explanation of why they're not here. All right, so the person that Wolverine knows that they're going to get is Quicksilver. Now, Quicksilver is an interesting character because it is hinted at in these movies, but never, I don't know if it's ever outright said. Maybe it is. But Quicksilver, the kid coming up here, is Magneto, Eric Lyncher's son. The kind of funny thing about that in regards to this movie is that Evan Peters, the actor who plays Quicksilver here, the dude bouncing back and forth the ping pong table, he's only 10 years younger than Michael Fassbender, who plays Eric Lyncher, his dad. But I just find that funny. Like, you have to love Hollywood. Yep, this is his son, but we're just going to kind of ignore the fact that Eric Lyncher would have been, 9, 10 years old when he had him. It's fine. Now, so there is a extended cut of this movie that I chose not to do for this because it's a little harder to get your hands on. It's called the Rogue Cut, and I actually like it a lot more. But in that movie, we get a kind of hint or kind of cameo of Quicksilver's sister here, who in the comics is Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, who, if you've seen any of the MCU Marvel movies, she's a kind of main character in that. She is kind of set up to do some really cool things in the future. She has her own Disney Plus series coming out. Who knows when, because, all production on things have been shut down because of the kind of quarantine and everything. But I just think it's an interesting nod that in that movie they hinted that, oh, she's out there somewhere. All right, so we got our full team assembled here, and we're doing our Ocean's 11 kind of heist breakout situation here. So we're setting up our tech guy here, Beast, Hank McCoy. So Magneto's power, you could tell from his name Magneto, is he. The short of it is he can kind of control metal. It's not exactly true. He can control magnetic fields, but the upshot is he can control metal. So you can't have metal around him, or he can manipulate it to do whatever he wants. Hence the kind of plastic guns, plastic batons, all of that here. Yeah, Magneto being in jail because of his actions in the previous X-Men movie, um, where he kind of, I guess, no, he's in jail because they think he killed Kennedy. That's right. Because in this movie franchise, they say that Kennedy was a mutant and that the kind of magic bullet theory was because Magneto was trying to manipulate the bullet to pull it away from him to save him. So that's a fun kind of nod, I think. I think this is a cool use of his power. So his power is he can move, ridiculously fast. I think it's an interesting use of it here to vibrate the glass so much and at such a high frequency and speed that it breaks. We're just going to ignore the fact that Magneto would be probably blind and completely cut up. We'll just ignore that. Right, so we get our kind of introduction here to our last prodigal son kind of storyline or character here in Magneto. So we have in the future, the old Magneto is, has come out of his prodigal son moment. He's moved away from his dark times. This Magneto has not. This Magneto is still in the midst of it. And so we're trying to get him out, trying to pull him back, get him out of his exile, get him out of his eating with the pigs time earlier in the timeline to try to help prevent things from happening. So I think it's fascinating that we really have three kind of prodigal son storylines going on. And the idea being, if we can pull all of them out of their kind of prodigal son moments, we can save the world. And so we'll see to the varying degrees of success our heroes have, trying to navigate these three different kind of main story arcs, these three prodigal son stories. So here's the hint to these two being father and son right there. That's kind of the hint you get in the comics. That's very much an established thing that we know. So these two kind of were friends for a while. Now, obviously, not so much. But Charles feels like they need each other right now to prevent the catastrophe that happens in the future. I do love the duct tape guard back there is just watching all of this, probably ridiculously confused. This might be my favorite scene in the movie. I think this scene was very, very well done. Like great way to display and show Quicksilver's power here. Love the soundtrack to it. Love the kind of nonchalant attitude he takes through all of this. I think it's great. I think the effects of it were really cool as well. It's almost like an elaborate puzzle he's setting up. Using the momentum of the gun blast to turn it into a fist punching him. I like that. You can see the payoff for all the stuff he did there. It's good stuff. All right, so our team is assembled. We've kind of broken everyone out, gathered everyone together, and now these four are going to go out to try to stop Mystique from killing Oliver Trask. So here we're having another I'm a time traveler talk. You have to believe me. You sent me here. This is just some of the greatest Ah, scenes. I absolutely love them. It's just a death stare going on here. It's awkward and uncomfortable. So those are the characters that we saw their autopsy reports previously. So we have just kind of a butting of heads here. Magneto feels that Xavier abandoned all of those people and left them to die. And Xavier feels like that Magneto kind of abandoned all mutant kind by painting them in a bad light, by displaying powers in a way that made everyone afraid. And I guess in some ways they both have a point, and in some ways they're both wrong. And that's kind of why these two are an interesting dynamic, is they want the same thing, but they just go about it in vastly different ways. All right, so things are in motion now. We have Raven kind of infiltrating areas, trying to glean information. She's trying to get ever closer to Oliver Task, to try to get him, to try to take him out, because she thinks if she can eliminate him, all mutants will be safe. Even though we know as the audience that's not the case. We've seen the future. We know that this will be the event that spurned things on. I think that line is interesting, the I'm alone line. Because she really is at this point. She has run from really two communities of people that she had built up and is truly isolating herself. And that hints at the idea of community. That really gets at the idea that she feels like she has to do this all on her own. And as a result, she ends up making bad decisions. She ends up going down wrong paths, being unable to see larger pictures. And again, her reasons for doing this are fairly, noble reasons. She thinks if she can be alone by isolating herself, she's protecting everyone else. She thinks that she is the only one strong enough to handle and do all of this. But in reality, by isolating herself, this is a little bit what we talked about in the Lion King commentary, that evil wants you isolated. Because when you're isolated and alone, you're much easier to convince. You're much easier to pull off a path. And so here she has self-isolated herself. trying to protect others, she only ends up creating a worse situation because she's trying to go it without a community. She doesn't have a community of support. She doesn't have that community of people to, pull you back in because, everyone has, no one can have everything under control. There's times when everyone needs some kind of help, and that's where a community steps in to help. But for her, she's pushed all that away. And as a result of that, in the original future timeline, she ends up making everything worse. She tried to save everyone by going at it alone. She tried to protect everyone, and in the end, she ended up dooming everyone because she was alone, because she shunned community. That's not the only reason that she failed or that she doomed everyone, because she shunned community, but that is definitely a big kind of factor into it. A community is there to help and support. So, the X-Men movies and comics, that's another thing I talk a lot about, is a community of support. Both Charles Xavier's school and and Magneto's Brotherhood, they form as communities of support. Obviously, one is a little bit, more a healthy community of support. The Brotherhood is a community that supports each other, but, supports the idea of trying to exterminate humanity. But it's this, it's getting at that idea that you need a community. In our case, being, at River Tree, that community is each other. That community is a community within Christ that can help support, that is rooted in Christ, led by Christ. So we can be that supportive community for each other and with each other in Christ. So here we're getting a little bit of the kind of backstory into why Raven or Mystique left. What led her down the path to that prodigal son story that she's now on. If we're going to stick with the prodigal son story, why did she leave her father to go off on her own? We're getting a little insight into why that is here. She, I guess kind of like in the prodigal son story, she felt like she had a better way. She felt like she could do better than Charles could. She felt like she could make it on her own and thrive in a better way for mutant kind where Charles couldn't. I think that's what a lot of the driving force behind the theme of the prodigal son is I know better. I can do this better, so I'm going to go out alone and do that. Oh, look at those sideburns. Oh, those are glorious. We haven't really talked a lot about Peter Dinklage here, who plays Bolivar Trask. I think he just nails this role. His portrayal here is interesting because in his own weird way, he's trying to unite humanity. He's trying to stop war. He's trying to stop conflict. But the way he does that is through finding a common enemy. He thinks if he can find an enemy for all of humanity to rally against, they won't fight each other and will, in a weird way, have peace. I mean, you have seen, military leaders in the past and, kind of dictators throughout history, overlords throughout history, kind of take this idea. This isn't that different from Hitler's idea of let's find that scapegoat. Let's find that group of others that we can pin everything on that will then unite us together. Not a great way to go about things, as you can obviously, as history's played out, as we know, we'll see here. Uniting a group of people together around hate will never garner the fruit, the actual kinship, bondship that you would get rallying a group together around a common good, around love. And that's where you get that community differences we talked about. You know, the Brotherhood, Magneto's kind of cohort of villains, they're brought together for the same reason. They're brought together and united around hate. Whereas Charles Xavier and the school, the X-Men, they're united and brought together around love, or around trying to protect, trying to do good. All right, so she's at her moment here, and our our heroes get here just in time to stop her. But are they too late? What is going on? All right, now Wolverine here is going to kind of have a freak out moment. So that guy on the floor there is the person who captured and tortured Wolverine in the future, Major Stryker. And so Wolverine is having his own moment of kind of existential crisis because he's seeing the person he hates most. He's seeing the person who took everything from him in the future. He's seeing him now. And at the same time, Eric here, Magneto, is really taking matters into his own hands. He is deciding Raven is too dangerous to be left alive. She is the key that destroys the future. It's not her act of killing Trask, it's her existing. And so you get into interesting discussions of free will versus fate with this. You get interesting kind of dynamics of forgiveness. Does just the mere fact of Raven existing put so much of a damper, put so much at stake that her life is expendable? You know, you end up wrestling with, again, these are two sides of how to address a problem. You have the Charles Xavier side, the kind of X-Men side of just because someone stumbles, just because they've lost their way, they can always come home. We can always welcome them back. Versus the Magneto side of, I need to stop this before it happens. You can't be allowed to live. You know, I need to stop this before it happens. So there's no real forgiveness with the Xavier side, or with the Magneto side. There's no grace. There's none of that. So it's a very kind of fascinating and a very, interesting way of how God and evil deal with problems, or deal with, I guess, the quote unquote humanity, the problem of humanity. Humanity is a sinful race. We live in sin. You have the one side of God's infinite mercy and grace that will always pull us through, that, the bridge to salvation, that is Christ, has been provided to us. So you have that in the Xavier side. And then you have the other side, the kind of justice side of it, in that, well, we all deserve to die. We all, we're not worthy to go into the graces of God. but a way's been provided for us. So you get that really interesting dynamic bouncing back and forth. You see kind of both sides of mercy and grace balanced with justice, balanced with righteousness. And I think that is such an interesting combination to see playing out on screen, to see those pulled apart and, really extended to their fullest exaggerated points here. So, earlier I was talking through it, but we saw in the future Wolverine kind of freaks out, his claws come out, and he actually cuts Kitty Pryde. A little bit later, when we go back into the future, we will see that there'll be a quick shot, and Kitty Pryde isn't there anymore. It's a different character named Rogue. A lot of stuff was shot. So okay, so we're back here. Kitty Pryde's wounded, she's hurt, she's dying. In this version, we just come back later and Rogue is there. Some other person is there doing the, holding Wolverine in the past. No explanation, nothing given. The Rogue cut, which is one of the reasons why I like it so much, is that entire storyline is discussed. You have a kind of group of people. It's Magneto and Bobby Iceman go out to free Rogue. We find out Rogue has been kind of imprisoned, and so they go off on a whole other side mission to go rescue her, bring her back in so she can take over. And this version, they just kind of ignore that, which I think is really funny. So just, seeing William Stryker, seeing the person that in his past and or future, depending on how you're looking at it, was enough to really try to pull him out. It was enough to really kind of set him on edge and cause that kind of freak out. Gotta say, I'm loving that Wolverine hair. Just look at that. that's a that's a pretty good kind of Nixon prosthetics they got going on there. All right, so we got a nod to the kind of missing time period or missing element of the Nixon tapes there. So there we get a nod again to the magic bullet element of the Kennedy assassinations. Now, one thing that I want to know is how did Trask get into this room? Right? Like he shouldn't really be in this room. This is the kind of president's inner sanctum, Oval Office. How did Trask get in here? Now, right there where he talks about the different people Mystique could impersonate. Later in the movie, she actually does impersonate all of those people in that exact order. So that's some kind of fun foreshadowing there. So we see kind of an interesting dynamic that had Rogue, not Rogue, excuse me, had Mystique not shown up to try to kill Trask, it doesn't look like his plans would have happened. The only reason people are now starting, the president here, Nixon, is starting to get on board with it because he saw the fallout of what happened. He saw Mystique. He saw Beast. He saw these people. They're now in the public consciousness right up front. So it's that interesting that whole time travel element of she is responsible for the very thing she's trying to stop. The mere act of her trying to stop it is the thing that initially creates it. Again, isn't time travel fun? That's what we're getting at that. She's starting to come back around to the prodigal son-esque life notion. Did she have a family? No, does she have a family? Yes. And she's starting to realize she had turned their back on that family. She's starting to realize she had walked away from the family she had. And even in that scene too, you get kind of that going back to the notion of the other, that nurse, someone so different. She's trying to figure like, well, does she even have a family? Does she have this? You get that, people think that someone different from them is so different. They start kind of exaggerating these differences. They start, and that's where you start getting that fear notion in there. So you start building those walls between you and the other, between anything different than you. It's just, very subtle ways this movie hints at that, how people almost subconsciously do that, put up walls when they don't even realize they're doing it. So again, we see kind of Raven's underlying notions of she doesn't want all out war. She just, in her mind, wants justice. That's what she wants. Even though, to the outside, that she wants revenge, which is a very different thing than justice. But it's something that's relatable. All of her friends from the last movie. And in the comics, one of them ends up being her husband, her lover, and they have kids with. We don't know how far that went into this movie, but is murdered, is killed by Oliver Trask. So her actions are understandable a little bit. She wants what she thinks is justice. We see it as revenge. And so that's a butting of heads, with that. But in her mind, she's trying to save lives. So you get that interesting, that's why I love her as a character. She is such a complex and just fascinating character. So you have a little bit of Xavier kind of starting to get his powers back here. He's hasn't quite made that turn yet. He's still doesn't fully believe, isn't fully coming out of the wilderness, isn't fully coming out of his eating with the pigs moment. He's still in his dark point. He's close, but he's not quite there yet. So this is really his kind of moment of truth in this movie. Arguably for Xavier, this is his high point. This is where he wins the movie. This is his arc coming to fruition. It's right there when he puts the needle down. He steps away. He starts making the journey back home. He leaves the pigsty. He's no longer eating with the pigs. He's coming back toward the Father. He's making his return as the prodigal son. So we have, of our three prodigal son stories, narratives we have going on, we now have one of them that has come to fruition. We have one of them that has moved toward coming home, returning to the Father, returning to the light. And so that ultimately is what we end up having. We saw at the beginning of the movie, the Sentinels that could take on any form. So that nod to Stryker's son is interesting because in one of the previous X-Men movie, X-Men 2, we end up seeing Stryker's son is himself a mutant. And we see how William Stryker there shuns him, pushes him away because of his otherness. Stryker can't see him as his son, sees him as something to be feared, sees him as something to be hated. So it's just adding another layer to the us versus them, the loving the other storyline, and all the negative, all the bad that comes from not loving the other. All right, so we're downstairs in the X Mansion. Charles Xavier is about to initiate Cerebro, that program that enhances his powers to levels to where he can identify and find both humans and mutants anywhere in any point on the globe. So they're going to try to use this to find Raven, to prevent her from, again, trying to kill Trask. So those silhouettes of people all around him are all of the people and the mutants all around the world. And he is trying to hunt through all of them to find one specific person. I do love how in these movies, Charles Xavier in the comics and in, the previous movies, one of his most famous features is his bald head. It's famously bald. And I love how they're just like, young Charles Xavier, we're giving him like the most luscious locks of all time. I think that is a great, I don't know, that makes me laugh a lot. This is an element that I love about time travel movies is you have this cyclical nature of kind of payment and repayment, kind of this yin and yang going on. In the future Charles Xavier finds Wolverine, saves him, pulls Wolverine out of his prodigal son moment, brings him back. Now Wolverine has to go into the past and do the same thing for Charles. So you create this kind of fascinating kind of cycle of Charles can do in the future can do it because Wolverine did it for him in the past. And so here we're, Charles is seeing into the future, seeing basically a synopsis of the first three X-Men movies. That was all of them. Yeah, it was your 30-second synopsis of those three movies and everything that Wolverine went through in those movies. So this scene, I think, might be one of the most poignant scenes in the movie, where you have young Charles Xavier talking to old Charles Xavier. He's looking up, seeing old Magneto standing there, just seeing everything that's going on in the future, seeing everything that he's trying to stop. So here we have the notion of hope. Young Charles had seemingly lost hope, but old Charles still, even in this desperate time, is holding on to that hope. We can show them a better way. We can move forward. I think this line right here might be maybe like the second most important line in this movie. When Charles says, "It's the greatest gift of all, to bear their pain without breaking. And it's born from the most human power, hope. We need you to hope again." I think that is such a profound kind of gospel-filled notion. Galatians talks about that we need to bear one another's burdens so that we might fulfill the law of Christ. Bearing one another's burdens is a way we can have hope. The law of Christ is rooted in hope. That's what it's about. The gospel is hope. So bearing one another's burdens, you can't do alone. To bear someone else's burdens, you need to be in a community. And this, I keep coming back to this notion of community. And that's one of the greatest gifts of being in a community is you can bear one another's burdens. So no one has to take on anything alone. No one has to feel like they're overburdened. You share others' yokes. And when you have multiple people sharing a yoke, it becomes manageable. It becomes something you can get through. It doesn't crush any one person. The group helps. The group moves forward. The group can bear, the burdens of all. That is a notion that I very, very much love in this movie. The greatest gift of all is to bear their pain without breaking. And it's rooted in hope. We can have hope because of Christ. We can have hope because we have Christ-like communities. That's just a notion that I absolutely love. So we're back in the feature now. We have Kitty Pryde isn't going to last very long here. She's fading fast, and here we're having kind of this discussion, this getting back to the idea of hope, getting back to the idea of trust. As we talked about, these scriptures are just littered with passages that talk about hope. You have Jeremiah talks about blessed is the person who trusts in the Lord, whose hope is in the Lord. There's just so many passages that address this notion that if we put our faith in God, we will always have hope. We will always have that notion that we are never alone. Romans 15 has that kind of same notion. Now may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing. So the God of hope fill you with joy and peace, that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one that can kind of move us forward, can really make us feel hope, can give us that hope. Always moving forward, always living in hope, because our God is a God of hope. It's like that's what the future X-Men are wrestling with right now. The notion of hope, the notion of how do we feel like we can move forward when we're so afraid, when everything's so stacked against us. In this movie, they're doing it because they have a superpowered Wolverine time traveling back in time. For us, we can hold on to hope because we have an all-powerful God, an all-loving God who won't forsake us, who won't abandon us. That's how we can have hope. That's the reason we can hold on to hope. It's because of Christ. It's because of the promises of Christ, the sacrifices of Christ. That's the reason we have hope. All right, we got a great Star Trek nod there. That's an episode that kind of involves a little bit of time travel. It's kind of a good nod. I have to say, Charles Xavier has some awesome shirts in this movie. Just look at that. Man. So see, we're not really in any better of a situation now than we were at the beginning of the movie. She's still set up and determined to kill Trask. So now we have to kind of rally and figure out how we're going to move forward. This is one of those deep philosophical conversations you have about time travel and destiny and kind of fate, which inevitably always comes up in any time travel movie. Because again, it gets back to those two different styles of time travel. The one where it's always happened and you can't kind of break out of it. That's, the Harry Potter style of time travel with the time turners, where they've always been in the past, even when they travel back there. So Hermione, Harry, and the group, when they travel back in time, we see remnants of them already having been there. And that's kind of what Hank is hinting at there. What's the difference in, does it make a difference? Does what we do change things? And that gets into some very, potentially deep philosophical, theological discussions of what is our fate? Fate versus free will. There's all sorts of discussions that are, we definitely don't have time to go into, and, the whatever it is, 20 minutes, half hour or so we have left in this commentary. But that is just a fascinating series of topics that I think time travel movies really lend themselves well to. So here, a lot of those things on the wall there are remnants of the characters from X-Men First Class that were killed. So you have the Wings, you have Havoc's, the character of Havoc's breastplate there. And just, kind of nods, kind of reminding you of the anger that both Magneto and Mystique have, that the people that were their family, were their friends, people that trusted them, are now dead. And so they're out seeking revenge. I think that gets into an interesting notion too. I'll do my best, like our best, because of Christ's sacrifice. Our best is all that's needed. We will never be perfect. Getting back to that initial quote we had, just because someone stumbles or loses their way doesn't mean they're lost forever. We will never be, full, sanctified, perfect imitations of Christ. We will always stumble. We will always, fail from time to time. That's inevitable. We will always sin. But it's if we just continually try to give our best, try to do our best, try every day to be more Christ-like. That's all we can do. And that's all, that God asks, is that we just do our best. There's no way we can ascend to that level of Christhood, Christ goodness in this side of heaven, in our lives here. But we don't need to. God doesn't expect that of us. That's the whole reason for Calvary, the whole reason for Christ. was so that we don't have to be perfect, because we can never be perfect. We would always fail. All we have to do is just try, just do our best. I think that's a freeing notion that some of that pressure is taken off of us. We we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be the best that's out there. We just have to try. We just have to continually and earnestly try. I think it's freeing that we have a God who loves us so much that God knew we would fail, knew we had pulled ourselves because of sin to a point where we couldn't we would never be able to earn the graces of God. So that's not required of us. The only thing that's required of us is to put our faith in Christ. Let Christ be that bridge for us and just do our best to emulate Christ every day. Right? Nothing bad will ever come of building giant battle robots, right? I've seen too many sci-fi movies. I know how this ends. I do love how that as these movies progress, Magneto needs a bigger and bigger thing to kind of carry him into the finale. In X-Men 3, it was he moved the Golden Gate Bridge. And now here it's nope, nope, I need to move an entire baseball stadium. I just love the continually growing progression going on. All right, so we're kind of at the tipping point here. In the future, the Sentinels are bearing down on our old heroes, and in the past here, Raven is at that point. She is, seconds away from murdering Trask in front of everyone, which would cause the events that we see in the future. So everything's kind of hanging in the balance right now. And so we have Magneto here, again, one of our prodigal son stories, not not coming out of the foreign land with the pigsties. He's still eating with the pigs. He's still at his deepest point. They failed to bring him out. So we have kind of one success with Charles. We have one failure with Magneto. So it comes, our tipping point is going to be our third prodigal son story, Raven. What are they able to pull her out of her prodigal son story, pull her out of her eating with the pigs now? Can they do that earlier? Can they pull her out preemptively? So I like the kind of bookending here. In the past, we're seeing the inaugural initial first flight of the Sentinels. And here in the future, we're kind of seeing what, win or lose, will ultimately be the last flight of the Sentinels, kind of happening concurrently. And I love that kind of bookend nature you get with good time travel movies. That is a lot of Sentinels coming through there. All right, so we have Storm trying to take them out before they can even get to them. Kind of utilizing her storm power, but ultimately that is just way too many. Look at, it's just fascinating to see how the Sentinels grew from these, 5 or 6 that we're seeing in this past to what we're seeing in the future. It's just endless wave after wave of them. All right, so in a weird way, Magneto kind of put things off, kind of is helping our heroes unintentionally in a weird way. Had he not brought the Sentinels, kind of taken over the Sentinels and started having them shoot at everyone, Mystique very possibly might have already killed Trask. So in a weird way, he's kind of countering what he's trying to do. But Mystique is still centered on her task. She still thinks if Trask dies, everything is better, everything is avenged. We know that's not the case. We know that's not avenging, that is revenging. That is just pure revenge, not justice. And again, I love the mirroring we have going on here. In the past, we have Magneto actively using his power for evil. Magneto is using his power against humanity, using his power to kill. Whereas in the future, this Magneto is using his power to save. So we're seeing very kind of different interpretations of power. And I love that, again, I love that bookendingness we're seeing. Because we can see ultimately in the original timeline, he does come out of his in the wilderness moments. It's just far, far too late. And as we see, he's used the stadium to isolate the White House, prevent outside help from coming in. So again, we have an interesting shift here in Magneto. Present Magneto, or Magneto in the future here, Ian McKellen Magneto, is willing to sacrifice himself for good, to protect people, willing to sacrifice himself for what he believes is right, to save humanity, to save mutant kind, to save all of that. Whereas past Magneto is willing to sacrifice everything else, everyone else, willing to sacrifice Mystique, willing to sacrifice whoever gets in his way. And it's just a very fascinating growth that that character undergoes. But in this timeline, undergoes that growth far too late. Is too far gone for too long, living in the prodigal son kind of limbo, out with the pigs, at his lowest point, far, far too long. So you can see here, he's willing to protect everyone. He's willing to protect Charles Xavier at this point in his life, use his powers for that. Whereas in the past, he's using his powers to try to kill Xavier and many, many others. So things are starting to get desperate. We're starting to see all of our kind of main heroes, Halle Berry. Halle Berry died. Storm, one of our original X-Men who we've seen in, multiple of these movies, is gone. So now that adds a whole other, there's no second chances for our heroes in the past here. If they don't fix it right now, it's not going to get fixed. Wolverine just punching a giant kind of metal fighting machine. So this is fascinating. This is an interesting kind of end to this movie for Wolverine. He is now, you'll see in a second here, he's going to get thrown out. He's out of the picture here. He's going to have no more bearing on the end of this movie. So all he has to hope for now is that the seeds he has planted, are they enough? He has to kind of hand it off now. I think there's an interesting notion in that for us in the way we evangelize with people, the way we interact with people on a daily basis. Sometimes we're not the one, the kind of person that ultimately leads someone to Christ. Sometimes we're the one that starts things going, which in this case, that's what Wolverine did. He started young Xavier down the path. He started young Beast back believing. He kind of put the ball in motion and ultimately gets taken out. He isn't the one that brings it to fruition. So I think there's something to be said. A lot of times we put pressure on ourselves to, growing up, there was that notion that, oh, if I don't try to save this person, they're going to hell. It's all on me. And ultimately that's not the case. We don't know people's path. Only God does. All we can do is just kind of listen to the voice of God and take the next faithful step. All we can do is just continually move forward. And so I think that's a great illustration there, that Wolverine's out of it now. He's not the one that ultimately saves the day, wins the movie. He inspired other people to do that. He wasn't the one that brought it home. And ultimately, we can't put pressure on ourselves to feel like we always have to be the one that ultimately brings people to Christ. Sometimes we just lay the groundwork. Sometimes we just put the ball in motion and other people come in. The Holy Spirit works in people long after we've gone, but works in them using some of the foundations, groundwork that potentially we laid. Again, this is getting at that notion of fear. They were afraid of the other. Humanity in this story was afraid of the other, afraid of the mutants, afraid of something different than them. So they tried to wipe it out. So that little girl there, that is Wanda Maximoff. That is the Scarlet Witch. So we see kind of ultimately where fear leads. In this iteration, fear of the other leads to this post-apocalyptic world where everything's destroyed. It looks, it's not even like humanity is living in a paradise with no mutants here. This future world is destroyed for everyone. So you see here, Magneto kind of laying the groundwork for what would go on to be his Brotherhood, laying the groundwork for a community of people, but a community of people centered around hate. A community centered around, again, hating the other. And ultimately, flipping back and forth, we see him kind of laying the groundwork for that community, flipping to the future, ultimately seeing where that community leads, ultimately seeing that a community centered around hate ultimately leads to destruction and the death of everyone. All right, so here we kind of get the reveal that that's not the real president. So that has to be Mystique. And so our third prodigal son story, we see how it turns out. She is ultimately coming out of the pigsty. She's returning home. She is putting aside her hatred, putting aside her lust, need for revenge, to love, to save. And even him, even someone else she hates at this point in time, she doesn't kill. So she's turned a little bit of a corner here. Not that much of a quarter, though. She still wants to kill Trask. She needs one more push. She needs one more kind of iteration of hope. It's the idea of a better path. It's the idea of a path where the other, where those different than you, where you love them, where they love you, where you don't see them as different. You see them as equal. They see each other as just people. In this case, humans and mutants, but for us, you see, just look past the differences. To have faith in each other, to have faith in God together. And that's what she ultimately does here. And it wouldn't be a good movie if she didn't make that decision at the absolute last possible second. Ultimately, her decision now has changed the entirety of the timeline. Her decision to love, not even necessarily to love, to not hate, to have mercy, her decision for mercy has changed the course of events. Mercy over love provided a brighter, better future. So again, we have that kind of idea of Charles chose mercy in that situation rather than take revenge, rather than let Eric go back to jail, where he ultimately probably would have been killed. The idea of choosing mercy. Now in this hyper kind of stylized, exaggerated world, but it's he's kind of breaking the law a little bit there. That's not the point we're getting at, but it's all of these characters at this point in time, they're choosing mercy. Yeah, poor Logan, just sitting at the bottom of the lake. His kind of healing mutant power won't let him die, so he's just hanging out there. Who knows how long he's been down there? Now, waking up again, unsure what timeline he's in, unsure what's going on. Even we as the audience aren't sure yet. But then we see some future clock kind of tips us off. We're back in the future. We're now seeing everything back to normal. Professor X's school back functioning again. All of these characters that we saw die in this movie, and even characters that have died in previous movies are all back. So their plan worked. Their plan fixed the timeline, fixed everything up to this point. So kind of the underlying notion here is that mercy, grace, leads to the better future, leads to this future where everyone has a happy ending. So just how confusing would this be, right? So he still has the memories of the original timeline. So he has no idea what has happened in the timeline he's currently in for the past, 50 years or so? Just how confusing would that be? So I mean, these two characters that died, 3, 4 movies ago, because of their events in the past, they're back. They're saved because of Raven's act of mercy. Raven choosing to not hate. So we have Xavier here, old Xavier now, but still kind of having the memories of the past Xavier, knowing that Wolverine came back in time to him. So for him, this has to be confusing as well. Because the last time these two talked with this consciousness was in 1973. So this movie could have really, like I said, the X-Men movie are notorious for just ignoring the continuity or the timeline of the previous movie. And this movie involves time travel. It could have reset everything and made it easy, but it doesn't. It does this. It 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 brings in, it tries to bring things back to the point of regularity again by having Wolverine once again taken by Stryker, kind of setting the timeline kind of roughly back to his story is as it was. So you have Stryker right there with Wolverine, just like it happened previously. But, okay, watch his eyes here. Watch him. Okay, they flash right there, meaning this is Raven. This is Mystique. So what is going on with that? Is future Wolverine, did he go through the program? Did he not? I feel like that ending just makes things more confusing than they ever would. And true to form, the next movie just kind of ignores it. So, but what are you going to do? So that was our commentary. That was the River Tree Community Church commentary for the movie X-Men Days of Future Past. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you maybe kind of learned something, had some fun with it. And now I have to go write my sermon for next week when we kind of talk about this movie. And I honestly don't know what I'm going to preach on yet. As I said, there's a number of great things here. You have kind of the notion of the other, notion of hope. You have the kind of prodigal son, three-tiered storyline going through it. You have the notion of grace versus hate, kind of that grace versus kind of revenge that's very strong in this movie. So there's a lot of good themes going on here. So now I will go away, try to figure out something, to talk about with you all next week. So thank you very much for sitting through this with me. If you enjoyed it, let me know, and I will talk to you all later. Have a wonderful evening, day, whenever you watch this. I don't know when you listen to this. All right, I will talk to you later. Bye.